Well, here's a devotional thought for today. In my own devotional time, I've kind of been working through again this devotional book by Martin Luther entitled Faith Alone, and it's got an entry for every day of the year. And the entry for yesterday, February 9th, is entitled Loving Yourself. And the verse that Martin Luther kind of has for that devotional thought is from Galatians 5:14 that says, "The entire law is summed up in a single command, love your neighbor as yourself." And then his devotional entry reads like this: Some of the early church fathers concluded from this passage that love begins with loving yourself. They said this because loving yourself was given as the measure for how much you should love your neighbor. I used to consider this from all sides to try and understand it. I understand this commandment to mean that only love toward your neighbor is being commanded, not love of yourself. First, self-love is already present in people. Second, if God had wanted to command you to love yourself, he would have said, you should love yourself and your neighbor as yourself. But he said instead, love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, as yourself means the way you already love yourself, without a commandment to do so. When describing love in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 5, Paul teaches that love is not self-seeking. It completely rejects self-love. In Mark 8:34, Christ commands us to deny ourselves. Philippians 2:3-4 clearly says, in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interest, but also to the interest of others. This commandment presupposes that people already love themselves, just as when Christ says in Matthew 7:12, do unto others what you would have them do unto you. Clearly, he isn't commanding you to love yourself here either. So it seems to me, Luther says, the part of this commandment that says, as yourself, is referring to the wrong kind of love, the kind where you forget your neighbor and seek only your own interests. But this can become the right kind of love if you forget yourself and think only about serving your neighbor. You know, kind of the line of thinking that's out there right now that goes the way of, you've got to love yourself first before you can love others, or you've got to love yourself first or you aren't going to be able to love others, or sort of get yours while you can, or make sure you take care of yourself first. And there's that line of thinking out there that can be very dangerous to us. Certainly there's a time in life for self-reflection, self-awareness, self-improvement. All of those are wise and helpful, and certainly there are times in our lives we need to do some self-reflection to kind of change some things, change some behaviors. But in the area of love, the problem with that line of thinking is that over the long haul, that can quickly turn into you do you and don't worry about who that affects, or just follow your heart because it doesn't really matter who you hurt along the way anyways, or it's all about you and who else really matters anyways. You know, what's real for each of us, as Luther kind of points out in that devotion, is that each of us is already pretty good at loving ourselves already. Loving myself is actually not something I had to teach myself along the way. Certainly, caring for myself, I've learned along the way and continue to learn what that means. But love, that's a little bit different. I kind of do that by default on my own, and I do that pretty well. The practical reality over time is when we buy into the line of thinking, love yourself first, is that when we buy into that line of thinking, love yourself, relationships begin to break. In fact, every relationship ever that has been broken started with someone in the relationship buying into the line of thinking, I need to love myself first here. And so over time, when we love ourselves first, relationships break. And so these words of Jesus, all of the law, the greatest command is this: love your neighbor as yourself. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and love your neighbor as yourself. That doesn't just make for a good Bible study or a good daily devotional or a good sermon. Those words from Jesus, they're practical, super practical. In there kind of lies the key to strengthening relationships in a moment, but also over time. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Love your neighbor, and as you sacrifice, as you look outward, as you put others' needs before yourself, over time those relationships get strengthened. And when we don't, those relationships, they break. Very practical words from Jesus that Paul echoes in Galatians chapter 5. And so maybe a challenging word for you today as you think about those relationships in your life that are most important, and then kind of the tears out from there. How are you doing with loving your neighbor first? How are you doing with sacrificing for the good of someone else? How are you doing with putting the needs of others before the needs of yourself? And so as you kind of think about that and consider that, those words of Jesus that Paul echoes in Galatians 5 and this devotional thought from Martin Luther from yesterday's entry, to maybe be challenged a little bit to put the needs of others more and more above yourself, because when we do that, those relationships are going to get stronger. So God bless your day as He gives you an extra measure of His Spirit to do that and to do that well. We love you, church. Keep up the good work. We'll talk to you soon.